Greetings, Fire Chargers, Darkblade here, and in today's video I will be reacting to Melchizedek, the most mysterious man in the Bible, uploaded by ReligionForBreakfast at timestamp. It was September 27th of this year, so almost 2 months ago. I will try to make this fast and not talk as much, because the original video is over 19 minutes long, and I'm only at 24% battery. So let's get into this. I don't even understand what this sad is of.
Genesis chapter 14 contains one of the most mysterious passages in the entire Bible. After a victorious battle, Abraham returns from rescuing his nephew Lot, who had been captured, and he encounters a man who appears seemingly out of nowhere. And King Melchizedek of Salem brought out bread and wine. He was priest of God Most High. This priest King Melchizedek blesses Abraham and praises God for delivering his enemies into his hands. Abraham responds by giving Melchizedek a tenth of everything he owns. This brief encounter has mystified readers for thousands of years for several reasons. Melchizedek appears suddenly, with no prior introduction or lineage, and then he's never mentioned again in the narrative. Also, he's described as both a king and a priest, a rare combo.
Not only is it that he's never mentioned again in the narrative, he's almost never mentioned again in the entirety of the Old Testament. I mean, the next time we even see his name in the original Hebrew is like Psalm 110 and verse 4.
And on top of that, he's a priest of God before the establishment of the...
Well, monarchs having both political and religious authority was not exactly that rare in the ancient world.
Official Israelite priesthood in Jerusalem, a much later arrival in Israel's history as the Bible tells it. Yeah, moreover, Melchizedek is a priest-king of God Most High. The Hebrew reads El Elyon. El was a widely applied epithet in the ancient Near East, not only for the God of Abraham, but also for a high god in the Canaanite pantheon. El Elyon in particular appears in...
And it seems to be the general Semitic word for God, as indicated by Arabic. You have Elah, Akkadian, there's the word is Elum, and there's also Elam or Elam in the Amorite language.
Several ancient inscriptions, and seems to have been a Canaanite and Phoenician deity worshipped as the creator of heaven and earth, though scholars still debate whether the name El Elyon refers to a single being or combines two different gods. So for which god is Melchizedek a priest? Even back then, no one could agree what that meant. So in this video, we're going to get to the bottom of the mystery of Melchizedek. Who was he? What did different traditions say about him? And what do we learn from his curious appearance in the book of Genesis? Melchizedek appears in just 3 places in the whole Bible. This mysterious passage in Genesis 14, then again in a brief mention in Psalm 110, and again in Hebrews chapter 7. In each chapter, it's clear that there's a bunch of context that we're missing. Psalm 110 briefly mentions a lineage of priests in the order of Melchizedek. Christians later situated Jesus in this lineage, inspired by Psalm 110. Hebrews chapter 7 in the New Testament presents Melchizedek as a priest who prophetically foreshadows the coming of Jesus. After all, Melchizedek is a priest-king who brings out bread and wine. Kinda sounds Jesus-y to me. Yeah. The author of Hebrews emphasizes that Melchizedek's priesthood is unique because it doesn't rely on genealogy, unlike the Levitical priesthood of Jerusalem, who descend from Aaron, the brother of Moses. The text says it is even more obvious when another priest arises, resembling Melchizedek, one who has become a priest not through a legal requirement concerning physical descent, but through the power of an indestructible life. In other words, Jesus could be a priest as well, in a lineage stretching back to Melchizedek. So how do we get from the Melchizedek in Genesis to the Melchizedek in Hebrews, a figure that foreshadows the Messiah? Well, both then and now, people love writing spin-offs, taking minor characters and their favorite content and elevating them to main character status, giving them new backstories, fleshing out their character, and putting them into new scenarios. Ancient Jewish...
Yeah, one example of this is with Abraham, with certain Second Temple and later Jewish writings, basically portraying him as like this brilliant mathematician, scientist, astronomer, basically a sort of Johannes Kepler of his time period and region.
And Christian writers did this with Enoch. They took a minor character mentioned briefly in the book of Genesis and made a whole Enochic cinematic universe with Enoch as the main character. In many ways, Melchizedek got...
And Nimrod now has his own sort of mini cinematic universe thanks to Alexander Hislop. However, the Nimrodic cinematic universe involves a lot of nonsense attached to it.
The same treatment, a minor character in the book of Genesis who's later massively elevated. There were two major ways that people interpreted him. We might call these the prototype interpretation and the exalted being interpretation. We can think of these as two answers to the same question. What does it mean that Melchizedek appears as a priest before there were priests among the people of Israel? Let's start with the prototype interpretation. This is clearest in Jewish rabbinic literature, like in a...
To make it clear that this is a reaction to his video and not his original video, in case you're watching it full screen, because I had his video full screen.
Collection of rabbinic teachings on Jewish law called the Mishnah and extended commentaries on earlier rabbinic teachings called the Talmud. In these texts, Melchizedek is most often portrayed as a proto-rabbi, a rabbi before there were rabbis who reflected rabbinic ideals. So, for example, circumcision.
The super rabbi, like you, the ultimate progenitor of rabbinicness or something,
is super important for Jewish identity. Well, according to these texts, Melchizedek was born circumcised. Knowledge of Torah is fundamental. Well, Melchizedek taught Torah to Abraham before Moses even existed. Put another way, Melchizedek proves that the rabbis stand in a tradition of piety that ran all the way back to creation. In fact, one tradition even says that Adam himself, the first man, passed on his priestly robes to Melchizedek, who then passed them on to Abraham. It was also common in ancient Jewish interpretation to
giving him this sort of clout. Basically making him like Rabbi to Electric Boogaloo, except with 0 instead of 2, because 0 comes before 1.
Translate the proper name Melchizedek as a title, the righteous king. So if Melchizedek was a title and not a name, what was his real name? A lot of rabbinic literature identified him as Shem, one of the sons of Noah. If Melchizedek was in fact Shem, of course it was no problem for Abraham to show him so much respect.
We're bringing back the goat.
Yeah, I heard about that from a certain video by Nathan83. And there's an ad. And I actually don't care.
However, not all rabbinic texts were so positive. Given that he's often viewed as a proto-rabbi, an exemplar of piety, rabbis needed to address a potentially awkward question. Why didn't Melchizedek's descendants get to be priests? After all, Israelite priesthood was hereditary, and his priesthood clearly predated the Jerusalem temple. Why weren't the Israelite priests in a lineage stretching back to Melchizedek instead of the brother of Moses? Well, according to one tradition in the Talmud, the key phrase in Genesis 14...
I think a most straightforward view would be something like, we don't even know if Melchizedek had descendants, something like that.
Is he was a priest. Was, past tense. This particular interpretation suggests that Melchizedek might have done something questionable. In Genesis 14...
Yeah, I think that would be a massive overreading. And from what I'm seeing on Bible Hub, the Hebrew doesn't appear to have a direct equivalent of was. Let me read it. Or Melchizedek, and I might be mispronouncing some of the words here. Melech Salem Hu هوتسيا لحم ويين وهو كهن للعليون. So literally, and Melchizedek, king of Salem, I'm guessing this is brought bread and wine, and he, priest of God Most High. So it appears that the Hebrew here does not actually have a word that is equivalent to was. And even if there was an equivalent, it might have just been saying, hey, Milk is just saying that, hey, these events that are described here happened hundreds of years ago.
Melchizedek blesses Abraham before he blesses the highest God. In other words, he prioritized Abraham over God. This misstep, according to some rabbis, resulted in the loss of the priesthood for his descendants. The text from the Talmud says, Abraham said to him, and does one place the blessing of the servant before the blessing of his master? Immediately the Holy One, blessed be he, gave the priesthood to Abraham. Interestingly,
I think that would just be a massive, what is it called? Eisegesis based on things that the text does not say. There was no actual equivalent of word for or was in the original Hebrew, just anti-priest of to God Most High, something like that. And even if there were a was in there, it could just be symbolizing the past nature of the events described in the book. Because these things are happening hundreds of years before the book was actually written.
Similar prototype interpretations are found in Samaritan traditions. As a reminder from my earlier video, the Samaritan Israelites are an ethno-religious group who trace their identity in scripture like the Jews back to antiquity. The Samaritan Israelites recognize the Pentateuch as scripture, and so they also venerate Abraham. And there's some partial evidence suggesting that ancient Samaritans also associated Melchizedek with Shem, one of the sons of Noah. As we'll see in the second part of this video, there's an argument that the Melchizedek...
So, what are some possibilities? This could have been through diffusion, cultural diffusion, or it might be a pre-schism element. But I'm not exactly sure if I'm on board with the idea of associating Melchizedek with Shem being like 2,700 plus years old. So I think it's more like a cultural diffusion. You would have some person maybe in the Second Temple period or later who has this idea, and eventually Samaritans adopt it and other people adopt it.
Passage in Genesis chapter 14 looks the way it looks because of anti-Samaritan edits. Turning now to the exalted being interpretation. According to this reading, Melchizedek has some kind of cosmic or even supernatural significance. Remember, this is a different type of answer to the same question. What does it mean that Melchizedek was a priest before there were priests among the people of Israel? This sometimes features in rabbinic literature as well, but it's much more common elsewhere. One of the most significant examples of a supernatural Melchizedek is found in a short tractate discovered among the Dead Sea Scrolls, a text with the super memorable name 11Q13. These materials were discovered in the late 1940s and revolutionized how we understood ancient Judaism. In particular, the Dead Sea Scrolls alerted us to the sheer variety of opinions within Judaism at the time. From 11Q13, we know that at least some ancient Jews represented Melchizedek as a figure who would be instrumental in bringing about the Messianic age, perhaps even instrumental to the forgiveness of sins on a final day of atonement.
There are 12 minutes left in the video.
At the end of time. For example, 11Q13 interprets a section from the book of Isaiah, which begins, "The Spirit of my sovereign God is upon me, because God has anointed me. I have been sent as a herald of joy to the humble, to bind up the wounded of heart, to proclaim release to the captives, liberation to the imprisoned." sounds Messiah-like. And if it sounds familiar to some of you, it's because the Gospel of Luke in the Christian New Testament represents Jesus claiming that he has fulfilled this section of Isaiah. But 11Q13 associates this joyful time to come with Melchizedek. It will be Melchizedek who will proclaim to them liberty, to forgive them all their iniquities. This Melchizedek in the final days will bring the sons of light to the path of Torah, and he's described
Like Melchizedek is the savior or something. Ideas, sentiments.
as waging war against the satanic figure Belial. But Melchizedek will carry out the vengeance of God's judgments, and on that day he will free them from the hand of Belial, and from the hand of all the spirits of his lot. Some interpreters understand the Melchizedek in 11Q13 as an angelic being, others interpret him as messianic, but what's clear is that this Melchizedek has cosmic significance. And this isn't the only place where we find an exalted Melchizedek. Let's consider a treatise found among the Nag Hammadi codices. These texts were found in Egypt and likely originated in an early Christian monastic context. They contain a lot of material that focuses on cosmic speculation and philosophy, and famously and problematically they've been called Gnostic texts, though from a scholarly perspective they're particularly interesting because they show us just how diverse Christian practice and thought was at the time. The Nag Hammadi Melchizedek treatise is highly fragmentary. Less than 50% of the text can be reconstructed. I mean, this is what my copy looks like today. It's really hard to read. But from what we can tell, it was an apocalypse of Melchizedek. Apocalypse in the sense that Melchizedek receives divine revelations, ultimately realizing that he himself is an expression of Jesus Christ, and that they will play a fundamental role in the cosmic struggle against Satan at the end of time.
Sounds similar to what I've heard about the Book of Enoch. Right. It's like some revelatory messaging and featuring Enoch himself being the Messiah.
The text prophesies that Melchizedek will prevail over malevolent, lower-order divine beings called the Archons. Be strong, O Melchizedek, great high priest of God Most High, for the Archons who are your enemies made war. You have prevailed over them, and
the CIA has particular skills in developing relationships.
And I have particular skills in keeping
you have prevailed over them, and you destroyed your enemies. This text also connects Melchizedek to a priesthood for all time. I am Melchizedek, the priest of God Most High. I know that it is I who am truly the image of the true high priest. In other words, Melchizedek is the archetypal priest. This is the mirror opposite of rabbinic traditions. Remember that rabbinic texts put a hard stop to Melchizedek's priesthood. He lost it. It was taken away from him when he accidentally blessed Abraham before God. But this Nag Hammadi Melchizedek aligns with interpretations that we find in the book of Hebrews, where the followers of Jesus are said to be priests according to the order of Melchizedek. Rabbis wanted no such thing, but Christians found that the answer posed by Melchizedek's mysterious priesthood pointed to a superior priesthood that ultimately superseded the Jerusalem priesthood. So what do we do with these two sets of interpretations? The main thing to notice is that Melchizedek posed a problem of interpretation.
9 minutes left.
Genesis 14 raises so many questions. What does it mean that he was a priest? Who is this god El Elyon? What city is Salem? Is it Jerusalem? And so a Jew who might have composed 11Q13, a Christian who wrote up Nag Hammadi Melchizedek, or the Talmudic rabbis of the 6th century, all read the same text, but they offered different interpretations. And it's no wonder, because Genesis 14 itself seems to have undergone multiple phases of editing. The text that we have now is likely the result of repeated revisions by editors who were not entirely happy with the tradition as it was handed down to them. Let's return to the central passage of Genesis 14. As a reminder, it's an earlier part of Abraham's story.
Will this be legitimate or redacted cadabra?
Before he had the son Isaac, and even before he had the name Abraham. He's still called Abram here, and he's already a leader with divine favor, getting caught up in the affairs of local kings. We need to look at the whole passage to really see how it may have been edited over the years. In verse 17, after defeating a coalition of Canaanite kings, the king of Sodom came out to meet Abram. And then, verses 18 through 20, King Melchizedek of Salem brought out bread and wine, and blesses Abram, invoking El Elyon. Then, in verses 21 to 24, the king of Sodom offers Abram all the spoils of war, but Abram declines. And then, in verse 22, Abram invokes El Elyon. So, what's so strange about any of this? Well, a few things. First of all, these Melchizedek verses completely break the narrative structure. The king of Sodom came out to meet him, and King Melchizedek of Salem brought out bread and wine. Wait, what? We were just talking about the king of Sodom, and now we're talking about the king of Salem, who then just disappears again? Second, Melchizedek blesses Abraham by invoking El Elyon, which, as we've seen, was a Canaanite deity, not necessarily the God of Israel. And then suddenly in verse 22, Abram invokes Yahweh El Elyon. Abram uses the epithet of Melchizedek's God to refer to his own God, adding the four-letter divine name known as the Tetragrammaton, a name that scholars think developed significantly later in biblical history. The simplest explanation that most scholars endorse is that the Melchizedek verses have been inserted into the story. The story makes total sense without verses 18 to 20. See what happens when we delete them. The king of Sodom came out to meet him. Then the king of Sodom said to Abram, "Give me the persons and take the possessions for yourself." The conversation flows between Abram and the king of Sodom. The same is true for the mention of the God of Israel using the Tetragrammaton. Scholars think the Tetragrammaton was added by later scribes who wanted to make it very clear that Abram was not swearing by a Canaanite god and only worshiped the God of Israel. This verse makes it explicit that the God of Israel and El Elyon are one and the same. This also gives the impression that Melchizedek himself was a priest of God and not some other Canaanite deity. So why do scholars think this? Well, check out the Greek version of Genesis. "I will stretch out my hand to the Most High God." The Greek translators seem to be directly translating the Hebrew words El Elyon, but not the Tetragrammaton, which is usually translated with the Greek word kurios. In other words, the Greek translators must have been sitting in front of a Hebrew manuscript without the Tetragrammaton. Now, Genesis was originally written in Hebrew, and then was later translated into Greek sometime during the Hellenistic period. But many scholars think that the Greek version, called the Septuagint, sometimes preserves an older version than what we find in the Masoretic text. The standardized version of the Hebrew Bible compiled by Jewish scholars sometime in late antiquity and the early medieval period. The scholar Robert Cargill, who's one of the leading experts on Melchizedek, argues that in the case of Genesis 14, the Tetragrammaton was added to the Hebrew Bible after the Septuagint's translation of the Pentateuch, which took place about 250 BCE. However, while a lot of scholars think that verses 18 to 20 were added entirely, he thinks that...
And I think there's a good reason why the whole Melchizedek thing was originally in there. It goes like this: "And Abram gave him 1/10 of everything. Then when the Melchizedek mini episode is done, we see, and the king of Sodom said to Abram, 'Give me the persons, but take the goods for yourself.'" Now, if Melchizedek was originally part of, if the Melchizedek mini episode was originally part of the text, and Abraham giving Melchizedek a massive tithe did actually happen, then it makes sense why the king of Sodom would say this part, because that he would see that his rescuer Abraham just gave a sizable amount of wealth to someone else and might be thinking of reimbursing him some amount.
They're original, but Melchizedek was originally the king of Sodom before being changed to the king of Salem. This would solve that awkward jump in the narrative. Rather than jumping back and forth between the king of Sodom and then the king of Salem and then back to the king of Sodom, Abram simply has a conversation with one king.
The king of Sodom's name is Berah in verse 2.
The king of Sodom...
"It is worth every kingdom and then
Another
I wish I had found
already.
you guys sooner, because I think I probably...
Back to the king of Sodom, Abram simply has a conversation with one king, the king of Sodom, Melchizedek. But why make this change? Well, changing Melchizedek from being the king of Sodom to the king of Salem makes a lot of sense. Sodom is a famously evil city in Genesis, and is destroyed by God just a little bit later in the narrative. Scribes would have been motivated to distance Abram, and Melchizedek for that matter, from having anything to do with Sodom. As for Salem, later...
But Abraham, then why didn't people try to censor or change Abraham trying to vouch for Sodom in order to get God to not destroy it, because Abraham had family there?
Interpreters argued that Salem refers to Jerusalem. However, ancient evidence doesn't really support this. In ancient inscriptions, Jerusalem is never referred to as Salem. It's always a multi-syllable name, Urushalim. We see this in the Amarna letters.
Isn't
These were correspondences between the Egyptian
technically
pharaoh and the Canaanite
multiple
kings,
syllables
and a few
long?
of these tablets mention the city Urushalim, or Jerusalem. Salem was probably a different city, and Dr. Cargill thinks it was a city located well north of Jerusalem, close to Shechem. Shechem was deeply important to Abraham's story. It was there that God first appeared to him, promising to give the land to his descendants,
4
and where
minutes
Abraham
left
built
in
an
the
altar
video.
to the Lord, marking the site as sacred. Salem being a northern
And
city fits with the general
19%
story of the
left.
patriarchs in Genesis, who spend a lot of their time up north, around Shechem and the city of Shiloh. But that change also had an
Well, the text doesn't say where Salem was or how long Melchizedek came to the field to meet Abraham, so guess it doesn't matter whether Salem was up north in the south or even in Korea.
intended consequence. Salem, as a northern city, was also close to Mount Gerizim, the holiest site for the Samaritan Israelites. They believe that the true rightful place for worshiping the God of Israel is Gerizim, not Jerusalem. Dr. Cargill argues that Salem's proximity to Gerizim made it geographically problematic for the later priesthood in Jerusalem, who wanted to disassociate the narrative from the northern region and Samaritan worship. He argues that scribes needed to find ways to clarify that Salem meant Jerusalem, not some other city. So many scholars believe that the Melchizedek verses were composed and added to the original narrative perhaps as late as the Hellenistic period, which, as it turns out, is when Melchizedek rapidly became more popular as a messianic figure, which helps explain why we get such a varied...
Didn't a previous video from him say that the Jewish anti-Samaritanism is a modern myth? I'm pretty sure his video said that.
Of Melchizedek. The story is already complicated. A mysterious priest king, a potentially problematic foreign god El Elyon, and the unclear city of Salem. But even more so, the story apparently was circulating in multiple versions, and no matter whose version you read, it contained a layer of edits that aimed to clarify the meaning and significance of Melchizedek that perhaps wasn't so clear in the earlier story. Overall, there's no one definitive answer to who was Melchizedek, not because we've lost the explanation, but because even in antiquity, the material was already being interpreted in multiple ways. Was he king of Sodom or Salem? Priest of El Elyon or the God of Israel? Was Salem up north or was it Jerusalem? Ambiguity was baked into the story from the start, compelling later editors.
Are there any ancient text manuscripts, copies, inscriptions, whatever, that indicate anyone as having ever thought he was king of Sodom or something like that?
To reinterpret what they were reading. Recognizing that biblical texts are composite documents with layers of authorship and interpretation is a crucial part of being biblically literate. Knowing that stories like Melchizedek's have been reinterpreted and reshaped over time helps us avoid simplistic or surface-level readings. But unfortunately, what's often presented as biblical literacy is sometimes used to push partisan agendas. Take, for example, recent news about the state superintendent.
And the rest of the video is presumably about Religion for Breakfast, sponsor for that video of his. So that's all for this video. Make sure to like and subscribe to both me and to Religion for Breakfast Original if you want. He's a good part of the way to 1 million. Anyway, I'll see you tomorrow. Dark Blade out.